members of the Council with us today in our panel. And I'd first like to introduce Dr. Ashok Gangadin, who has been a professor of philosophy at Haverford College for the past 35 years, is founder-director of the Global Dialogue Institute, co-convener of the World Commission on Global Consciousness and Spirituality, has hosted an Emmy-nominated live television show on global issues, and published several books on global reason, global philosophy, and dialogue. He will soon host a television series on patterns of the universe, bridging science and spirituality, as well as working on a new book, Awakening of the Global Mind. Dr. Gangadin has also been a key figure in ongoing interreligious dialogue. Please welcome Dr. Gangadin.
Thank you, David. I would like to, in the spirit of dialogue, we're just going to take a very short time, not to give a whole other theme develop, but just to elaborate on the themes beautifully opened up by Ervin Laszlo on the chaos point and what it means for us now on the planet, and the question of consciousness, which I'm so happy he ended with, which of course is central to his work, the idea of conscious evolution and the evolution of consciousness. And David just gave you a quick sense of the World Wisdom Council and its formation and its vision and its mission, which has to do really with focusing on helping to bring the question of consciousness and wisdom to the forefront of our culture at this chaos moment. Because the key factor, we may not realize this, but there is such a thing as global wisdom. And what is that? I'd like to comment on that and speak about how global wisdom is vital at this point, and to give a sense of why there would be efforts to build a World Wisdom Council and the World Wisdom Alliance, which we just launched here in Toronto a couple of days ago. Because if we step back, and this is very important in terms of the future studies, and seeing it through what I would call a global lens of global wisdom, to see the evolution of consciousness which has shaped reality and our cultures over millennia. That's a perspective I'd like to very briefly touch on to further open up our dialogue. And I hope we leave time for a conversation with you on this. Most of us don't realize that what is global wisdom, and why do we think that opening up the lens of global wisdom is a new dimensional shift in consciousness? It is a fundamental shift in how we process ourselves in the world. But it's deeply seeded in our great wisdom traditions, East, West, North, South, indigenous, for millennia. And that's what I wanted to give a sense of. Because most of us live in our worldviews, we're raised in our culture, the lens of our mind is shaped. Whether we're, say, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, the mind is being shaped in how we process ourselves and everything in our world and experience, including others, how we see others, is processed through that lens. And we don't realize that if I want to understand someone who's living in the Chinese mind space, or the Hindu world, or the Buddhist world, or a world that's very different from the shape of the ecology of the Judeo-Christian mind, it takes profound skill to step back critically from privileging one's own lens, to be able to access the lens of the other, the mental ecology, to shift into that world, to see from the inside what the Buddhist mind is seeing, or the Hindu mind, or the African Dogon mind, or the Lakota Native American mind, and so forth, the mind of science. And if we can step back from privileging whatever our lens is, including the lens of science, because that's a particular lens too, that processes reality, and begin to take into view, in the spirit of entering these other worlds, the sense of what has been evolving across cultures in the evolution of consciousness over millennia, you begin to quickly notice astounding trends, mega trends, that we can't see as readily if we're within our more myopic, more narrow lens of a particular culture or orientation. And one of those striking things that becomes noticeable, if we could enter what I would call the expanded global lens, is that visionaries, teachers, traditions for millennia have been noticing that the gravitation of consciousness is to somehow articulate and name and recognize and come into relationship with what the profound unifying force of the universe, that there is a unifying force that holds the universe together. And to be a thinking conscious being wherever you are in your life and culture and evolution, somehow consciousness gravitates to that. So if you step back and look, you'd see the Chinese naming this in the classical wisdom, the Tao. The Tao is a name for the infinite unifying force. And it's seen right away that the everyday language where most of us live, I'm going to give it a name for that. I'm going to call it the ego lens, where you're seeing things in a more narrow screen of consciousness. Whatever your culture or orientation, if you're processing yourself and your world in what I would call the ego mental lens, which is where the thinker separates himself and objectifies whatever appears on the screen of your awareness. And that's been the common state of evolution of cultures. All of our great traditions notice that if we get stuck in the box of the ego lens and process ourselves and our world there is constitutive, deep, structural fragmentation, polarization, bifurcation, alienation, and ultimately the deterioration of one's personal life and interpersonal life and intercultural life. So the essence of the Tao tradition is to teach wisdom. This is giving you a sense of the collective wisdom leading to what I would call global wisdom, which points precisely to supporting what Dr. Laszlo has pointed out as the chaos point. I'm trying to give a very quick fast forward to see across these different traditions, they're pointing to arriving at a moment in our cultural evolution on this planet where the older, immature, adolescent stage of our consciousness, which has been in this more egoized view of processing reality, is going to fragment and reach a crisis point. That's going to be an incredible opportunity to evolve into more integral, holistic consciousness, which is the embodiment of global wisdom. So that the Tao tradition is saying the Tao that is named in the ego mind space is not the Tao. The Om tradition of the Vedic Hindu saw Om is that infinite field, infinite force that unites and makes sense of reality and lights up our mind. But all of Hindu wisdom is saying, and if you read the Bhagavad Gita, that's what it's all about. A voice of Krishna, the integral voice, in dialogue with Arjuna, the ego person who is broken down in war on the battlefield, and his life implodes in an identity crisis. And he turns to the higher voice and says, please help me, I'm lost. And so that's the dialogue unfolds. And all of yoga technology and yoga science is giving the prescription of how do you recognize you're in the ego space, why it divides and separates and fragments and leads to breakdown, and how to get into an integral consciousness. And I would suggest that and that was all of Buddha's awakening. Buddha's awakening was essentially recognizing the ego is to suffer. It has a cause, attachment to the ego self as an object, which we process in this ego space. We become things, objects, bundles of information. And we buy into that. And that, when we objectify ourselves, then we suffer. And because we're not connected. And the ultimate insight of Buddha in his awakening is that we have a choice, as Dr. Laszlo said. We have a choice in how we conduct our mind. We don't have the ego. And the essence of Buddha's teaching, the Four Noble Truths, the fourth one is you can rehabilitate the patterns of your consciousness by practicing mindfulness every day in every aspect of your life, in your workplace, in your intentions, in your decisions and choices, in every aspect of your mental life. You can rehabilitate your mind to go into deep connectivity, where you find your humanity in connection with yourself, with others, and with the ecology. And that's the Dharma. That's awakened moral consciousness. And I would suggest, and very briefly, I can't do it now, but I want to give you a quick sense that if you go into the heart of the Judaic tradition, where the call of God to Israel is love me with all your heart and mind and soul and strength, and the struggles of Abraham in his faith vis-a-vis Isaac, and the question of sacrifice, and do we put God first or our own agenda? In that deep struggle, very much like Arjuna's struggle to step back from the ego lens into this deeper space, is at the heart of the Judaic tradition. And it doesn't take much to see that Jesus and all of the life of Jesus is attempting to embody our transition into this integral reconnection with unity and the unifying force. And so too with Islam, which is all the Judaism, Christianity, Islam are all from the same biblical Abrahamic tradition. And all of Islam means surrender to God, which means what? Reorient your life from egoing first to going in deep connectivity. And we could just go fast forward, but all of our great indigenous traditions were somehow tapping this deeper space, and now science is beginning to enter into the vocabulary of deep connectivity, where everything is interconnected. Not the way we see it in the ego lens, where we objectify it and make it into objectified things and properties. So that if we now go into the heart of frontier science, and this is where I think Dr. Laszlo, as a systems theorist in terms of whole systems and integral thinking, is tapping a deeper level of the evolution of science itself to process connectivity in this deeper calculus of the mind. So what I'm inviting us to think about is, how do we go into that space of connectivity that all of our traditions have been urging us to transition into to become humans? So I'm basically just trying to get on our radar, but it's often forgotten. Most of us don't even think about this, that the ultimate technology is a technology of consciousness, of how we're using our minds. Almost like operating systems. If our operating system has evolved only to the space of what we call egoing, where we process our worldview in the box of the screen of our awareness, and unbeknownst to us, that is causing fragmentation and ultimately violence, because different worldviews are appearing in that screen. And they're incompatible. And you have 9/11s, you have Holocausts, you have genocides, you have breakdown of human relations. You have suffering within because we're fragmented across our multiple identities. And we don't get the connection between the technology of our thinking and the misery and pathologies at the individual and collective level. So the wisdom of our traditions is urging us that we have a choice in reframing the habits of our mind to go into deeper connectivity of deep dialogue, not monologue through our ego lens, but to open up to deep dialogue is to go into deep connectivity where one begins to see and experience oneself in the other, in the ecology. You see or experience your connectivity with the rainforest, with the ocean, with the ice cap, and with everything in your life. So the ultimate technology that shapes our reality is a technology of consciousness. And the shift that we're in terms of the chaos point, is can we, at this point, and this is the exciting point that Dr. Laszlo, we all agree, it may look dismal, but when you realize that this is not an overnight thing, there's been millennia, this evolution out of the ego dominance of ego minding into integral holistic thinking and rationality to become fully human. It really is nothing less than the maturation of our species from separated entities and objects that we make ourselves into deep connected energy fields where we flourish as human beings, and where is the point of sustainable culture. So the exciting challenge now is that global wisdom connects with global science, integral science, in a common deep diagnosis of the main event on the planet, which is a shift in consciousness from dysfunctional, pathological, fragmenting ways that lead to violence and lack of human and unsustainable, the curve that goes down into unsustainability, or the shift in the upper line to sustainability by awakening to our innate heritage to become whole, integral human beings, where we can connect in the deepest form of dialogue and become fully mature moral beings and rational beings and scientific beings, where we can find ourselves in the other, which is the essence of the moral law. So I just want to invite us to keep that in mind as we proceed. Thank you.